Welcome to LOA Today. Walt Thiessen and life coach Cindy Chavez here. Today is Tuesday, January the 8th, 2018. It's 8 a.m. in New York, 5 a.m. in Los Angeles, 1 p.m. in London, and in Sydney, Australia, it is 12 midnight. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us once again for this live stream and podcast recording of LOA Today, your daily dose of happy. We are very glad to have both of our recorded listeners and our live listeners. And if you're a live listener, please feel free to put your comments and questions into the comments section on our page, LOA Today, and we will include them in the podcast, particularly the questions, as much as we can, as we get into our next project, Cindy. We have been moving through Neville Goddard, and we're like, what, 40% of the way through, something like that, 50% of the way through? We've covered a lot. I never thought we would cover this much, really, honestly.
This will be, I think, our fifth Neville Goddard book.
Yeah, I think that's right, which is astonishing. Yeah. Who'd have thought?
It's exciting.
It is, yeah. And it's been educational and very informative. We've gotten some good feedback from our listeners, so we know that we're talking about stuff that they like hearing about. But yeah, it's exciting stuff. So how you doing? We haven't talked in a week.
Well, I was going to say we also have a listener or two or more, but a couple that are big Neville fans and have brought us some information that was new to us, fun stories and anecdotes, and that's always fun too. So
absolutely,
if you're listening and you're a Neville Goddard buff, feel free to chime in because we love hearing that stuff.
Yeah, no, good point. I'm glad you mentioned that, and people are already logging in with their hellos and getting the commenting going, so that's great. So hello, I see Nasha's in there. Hello, Siraj. hello, guys. Glad you can make it today. And this is going to be fun because this is interesting too, because the book that you and I both have, this compendium of Neville Goddard, which has all of his 10 books in it, has been very useful. But it's also interesting the way that it lays them out, because the book that we're doing next is actually the first one in the compendium, and I think it was the first one deliberately. I haven't checked all the dates yet, but I mean, do you know, was the compendium put together?
If you open the cover, I don't have my copy right here because I'm using the browser, but there's like a flap on the.
I see. Yes, so they are in date order. Okay, yes, that's what I was wondering.
It's got the dates, and I think this is a really early one. Is it the first one?
It is the first.
1941 or something.
It's the first one, right?
I saw that last night, and I thought, oh wow, I don't think I recognized until last night that this was the first. I don't know if it is his first book, but it looks...
I think it is. I mean, because it lists the dates for each one in order, and they are in chronological order. So the first one was published in 1941, Your Faith is Your Fortune. And so that means this is the one where he starts laying out for the first time the concepts that he addressed in his talks that he was giving in New York City on a regular basis. But this is the first time he put it down in print, which means we should be running into some really foundational comments and commentary while we're reading this thing. The only thing that I'm a little wondering about, I can't say I'm leery of it, but I'm a little bit wondering about how much of the scriptural stuff are we going to run into. I suspect we're going to run into a lot.
Going to be a lot.
Yeah, I have that feeling.
There's going to be a lot. And the other thing I wondered about, and I have no idea, because I've never analyzed all of Neville's writings together against each other, comparison studies. But I know that as we move through life and as we develop, our thoughts, that often we change what we think. We change our ideas about things. Sure. Our ideas will evolve and develop. And I was wondering last night when I saw, this is a really early one. I thought, I wonder if anything in this book, I don't know, if any concepts in this book get left behind as he moves forward with his writing for the next 2 decades, or if he changes any of his thoughts or anything. I thought, it'll be interesting to see because
it's a good question.
That happens.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we're kind of doing it out of order, so we may have to be a little bit vigilant in order to notice stuff that seems to be different from what he talked about later on. But we can do that to some extent because we've done 4 other books. So yeah, let's pay attention, see what we can spot.
Yeah, and I know we're going to have to be quick on the decoder rings here because he is going to bring up a lot of things. But like you said, since it's his first piece, he may be explaining it a lot as if explaining it to a brand new audience. So that may be a good thing for us.
Either way, I've got my decoder ring ready. We need it. So yeah, we're set. We're ready to go. And
all right.
And I want to mention before we even get into it that there is a subtitle to this book. The book is called Your Faith is Your Fortune. The subtitle is Man's Faith in God is Measured by His Confidence in Himself. And that's really an interesting subtitle to have, especially in light of what we know from having explored some of his later books about the equivalence that he places with the word God and the word consciousness, and what's the other equivalent that he uses for it?
Well, imagination.
Oh, imagination, right, yes.
Right.
So man's faith you do a little word replacement. Man's faith in his imagination is measured by his confidence in himself. Well, that certainly makes sense. And then man's faith in his consciousness is measured by his confidence in himself. So now all of a sudden that subtitle starts to take on some really strong meaning just by having had a glimpse ahead.
Right, and that line that's used for the subtitle, man's faith in God is measured by his confidence in himself. It was actually the ending line in another chapter of another book, because I remember we spent some time on it, and I'm trying to remember which book it was. But the thing that's interesting is what you just said, and that is that if we take those words and replace the word God with the word imagination, because we know from Neville's teaching that he equates them, then it would say that man's faith in his imagination is measured by his confidence in himself, or man's faith in the ability of the imagination to create, because that's really what we're doing here, right? Is we're wanting to build up our faith in our own ability to create things with our stream of consciousness or with our focused thought.
Exactly.
And so we can tell where we are by how confident we are just in ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, before we get into the book, I saw a couple of I saw a question and I saw a comment from Nasha to remind everybody. Part of the last podcast you and I did last Wednesday, Nasha brought up the fact that one of our listeners, Deidre, had been in the hospital and was facing possible emergency surgery. And so I just wanted to do an update on that because you led us in a really wonderful little thing to create a vignette of Deidre being healthy and participating in the group. And I don't remember all the elements that you brought in, but you created this really nice vignette of her being in a really healthy space. Nasha sent me a message, I think it was last Friday night or Saturday, saying that Deidre did not have to have the emergency surgery. And today she's saying she wanted to thank you and me. Deidre is home. It was a miracle that the operation didn't take place, and thank you and all the members of the podcast for the help. So it worked. How about that?
That's wonderful. And I have to go back and listen, but that was actually part of the vignette, that we would be sitting here and that we would see a message come in that said she didn't need the surgery. And that, so that's really great. That's wonderful. I'm so happy that she's well and home and avoided that surgery. And wow, it's really cool that we all got to chime in and use our focused thought to support that outcome.
There's also a fun little connection to our Friday afternoon podcast, the one that I do with Linda Armstrong and Carlos Balasquide. Carlos, Linda's been telling Carlos quite a bit over the last few weeks that he is primed, that something, big stuff's going to happen to him with his career and so forth. And since then, he's been getting a number of auditions in Hollywood. I know that he got an audition for what was being considered as a primetime game show of some kind. He's also had a couple of appearances, small guest appearances and so forth, crowd scene, I would imagine, that kind of stuff. But as a result, the last 2 Fridays, he's been unable to make it because at the last minute, he got notification that he had been called on to a set to play a role or to participate in some way. So that was starting to add up in a good way for him. And when he texted me on this past Friday to apologize, like, I'm so sorry I can't make it this week, And I said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Thank you for letting me know, and congratulations. This is really exciting." He texted back to me. He says, "Yeah, this stuff really works." And so when Nasha sent me her note on late Friday or Saturday saying that Deidre didn't have to have the operation, she quoted Carlos saying, "Yeah, this stuff really works."
This stuff really works. That's right.
Which
so
is
you
really
can all
cool.
really know that the podcast host and co-hosts really do believe that this stuff works and
Absolutely.
really do use it, right? Use it, yeah.
It's
That's
really
fantastic.
cool stuff.
That's really great news.
Now, we also have a question from Suraj. Suraj says, well, it's not so much a question, it's more of a request. He says, please have a conversation on visualization and imagination. How to work out on this using LOA. Also, let us know meditation techniques about visualization, which is kind of what we're going to talk about with Neville, but maybe we can give him like a little overview of the way we look at, how we handle visualizing and imagining and just applying this Neville stuff and Abraham stuff and all the LOA stuff.
Yeah, well, I was going to say this is sort of Neville's forte, so I know that we will cover that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, asking that question of the two of us may bring really different answers because of the idea about visualization.
Yes.
And the ability to visualize. But I think my own experience of that has changed since we've been really focused on Neville so heavily for the last year, because what I think I notice is that now when I visualize, I immediately go to the senses, especially feeling. Like, you were commenting last week that one of the things you hear me say a lot is when I'm developing a vignette is I'm imagining my body in the chair,
right,
or my feet flat on the ground. And you were saying that's really nice because it's like bringing us into a place where we're grounded.
Yes.
And I thought, I think that's my go-to. Like, that's the first place I start. What are my hands doing? What are my feet doing? Are my hands flat on a table? Are they on the arm of a chair? Are they touching something? And so I know that when we say visualize, we automatically think of like our sense of sight, or even with our eyes closed, we think of what we're seeing. It's like eyes open seeing or eyes closed seeing, where we could describe it. I saw, right? I saw blue sky, or I saw, a person or whatever. But visualization in the sense of using it as an LOA tool actually takes in all of the senses. So that's actually part of the visualization, that I could maybe taste the tea in my cup and feel my hands on the tablecloth and hear the sound of birds singing and see my friend standing there and reach out and shake Walt's hand. It's feelings. And it's something that, this sounds maybe odd, but it's something a blind person would be able to do. Right? It's not basing itself on only the sense of sight.
Right.
So whether you have the sense of sight or not, you can visualize to use it as a tool for law of attraction. And you do that by bringing all your senses into it. So that's the most important thing that I can tell you about that. And as far as using it in meditation, just finding a place where you can be quiet and not disturbed, turn your phone off, stop looking at screens for a while, sit in a comfortable spot, and shut your eyes and tap into those senses, even if it's just for a moment or two. And if you can get to 10 minutes or 15 or 20, even better, but better to do it for 2 or 3 minutes than not at all.
Right. Yes,
that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think you're right. I love that. In fact, you're reminding me that I have been not consistently, but occasionally trying to bring the senses in and realizing what I'm experiencing there is very much what I experienced when I first started trying to imagine what I wanted to have happen. When I first started trying, I could only kind of grab like little shards, little bits and pieces, little scraps of an idea. Putting together an entire imagined scene was more than I could do at the time. And I've gotten better and better at it over time, but now I'm experiencing the same thing with sensation. So if I think about what you've often talked about feeling your feet on the ground. So if occasionally, not always, but occasionally I remember to, yes, okay, let's start with my feet are on the ground. In fact, I might even stand to do that. And then as I feel my feet on the ground, then I say to myself, okay, what else do I do? And then I draw a blank. And occasionally I can think of, oh, well, maybe there's a sound I can hear. And so what I'm finding is I'm very slowly and in painfully tiny steps learning to remember to apply this idea of experiencing the five senses during the visualization process. And I say it that way to basically let people know and remind them, don't be turned off by the fact that you're having trouble getting it started, that it takes a little while to get going on it. I'm having trouble getting going on it too. I think a lot of people do. The main thing is you just keep taking the steps. You do it as often as you can remember to do it. And you try to make it a commitment to yourself. Yes, once more as I do my visualizing today, once more as I do my meditating, I'm going to try to bring in every single one of those senses. What are the five senses again? Oh yes, they are sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And what I sometimes remember to do is to reorder them in the order that for me is the order of strength. So for me, audio, sound is the strongest, touch is second strongest. It's usually a tie between it's usually a tie between smell and taste, and it's vision's usually at the end of the list. That's what I'm trying to get to. So I order it in that way, and then I try to work through them one at a time. And you know what? So far, I've not yet managed to do all five, but I'm getting closer to it.
Another thing that might be helpful for some people is, and I think we've talked about this before, but I developed like a little end of the day meditation that just takes a moment, but it's where at the end of the day, even as you're getting ready for bed or getting ready for sleep, thinking about five things that you enjoyed or that you're grateful for that are all connected to one of the senses, and not letting yourself do the same list over and over. So it may be, oh, today, what do I remember that smelled really good? Oh, I smelled those roses. They smelled wonderful. And what about taste? Well, I remember my morning coffee tasted really good. And I remember, I felt some fabric and it felt soft, and you can go through the list. And what happens when you do that, if you make a habit of it and you do it every night, it just takes a second, is that throughout the day your brain gets ready, because it's like, oh I'm gonna have to answer these questions later on tonight, so I need to pay attention and
right.
Pay attention to what I'm hearing and seeing and smelling and tasting, and that starts to bring you a sense of awareness of your senses. And that will make it easier when you do go into a conscious meditation of, trying to create a vignette and imagine things that are in these senses, because you're doing it all the time anyway.
So you're using it as a way to kind of give yourself material to work with when you're creating
it's a mindfulness practice. Yeah, it's just to open your awareness and just get you used to doing it. It's sort of like when you're driving a car in a new city, your brain really perks up, right? Because you don't know your way around, and you have to pay attention to the street signs and to the traffic, and you can't really go on autopilot like we sometimes do when we're in our own neighborhood.
Right.
Hopefully not too autopilot in your own neighborhood, but you know what I'm saying is that when you drive a certain way every day or you walk a certain way, you kind of can do it while you're thinking about other things. But when you're in a new place, you have to really pay attention. And so your mind goes on high alert. That's the same thing that happens when you're using these processes for conscious creation. And that's why it's hard, is you're in new territory. So I hope that helps with those questions about visualization and meditation.
Well, I think it did. He actually has a follow-up. So let me bring the follow-up in. He says, but my wife always let's see. Wait a minute. I think I'm missing a key portion here. Did I lose? I think I missed a part of an earlier comment. Well, I'll try to get it back. The portion that I have says, my wife always likes to destroy my visualization. How can I control my wife using the law of attraction? Just kidding, to make our conversation happen.
So you've got dueling magic wands over there.
Yeah, right.
Like. Well, I tell you what, if you can both get on the same page with what you want to create, you'll have double the power to create it. And then you can work together instead of work against each other.
There is absolute truth in that. No doubt about it.
All right. Well, Walt, did you have any announcements that you wanted to make before we dive into the Neville book?
Sure, yeah. Actually, I haven't been getting those in midstream. I've been, if anything, getting them in at the end. So, yeah, it's a good time to do it. If you're a subscriber, or if you're not a subscriber, rather, to the podcast, please become one. The links are in almost everywhere that we post these podcasts, recordings, and do the live streams. So just find the link for your kind of device and click it. It'll walk you right through the process. If you don't see a link, just go to the homepage of our website, loatoday.net, and you'll see a great big icon for Apple device users and another great big icon for Android device users. Just click the one that's right for you. It'll walk you right through the process. And then after you've done that, make sure every time that you're listening to one of our episodes, do some liking, do some commenting, and do some sharing with people who you think might be interested in what we're talking about here, because that's how we keep expanding our reach. And finally, make sure you take some time to send us a comment, send us a note, send us an email, ask a question on one of the live streams. Interact with us, because you can tell every single time we get something and then I can remember to do it, we include it in the conversation. So get your questions answered that way, and we love hearing from you. We had a great email last week from somebody, a gentleman from Ecuador who was having a couple of issues, and it perked up our day for all of us who were involved in answering that question. So yeah, please contact us.
Wonderful. Yes, please do. Mm-hmm. And thank you, those of you that are interacting with us and sharing and
exactly.
and contacting us and giving us a shout out. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right. So a brand new book, a brand new Neville Goddard book today that we're trying to get into here. Let's see how we do with the first chapter.
All right.
Your faith is your fortune. Neville Goddard. Man's faith in God is measured by his confidence in himself. Now, I will say this disclaimer that I say whenever we start a new Neville book, and often as we move through it, and that is that Neville uses a lot of New Testament scripture, Christian Bible verses.
Oh, yeah.
He uses some other texts as well that are mystical or religious texts, but he always has a very esoteric way of defining what he says these texts mean. So even though the verse may or may not be, something that you're familiar with already, I guarantee that his take on it may be something you've never heard. And so just, whether that is something that gets you excited or something that makes you nervous, just go with us for a little while and see what you think. So open mind and open heart and see what Neville has to say.
Good.
He says, before Abraham was, verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am, quoting from the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Another quote from John. And then Neville's explanation. In the beginning was the unconditioned awareness of being. And the unconditioned awareness of being became conditioned by imagining itself to be something. And the unconditioned awareness of being became that which it had imagined itself to be. So did creation begin.
Interesting choice of word there, unconditioned.
Right? It's like new.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that he says the unconditioned awareness of being became conditioned by imagining itself to be something.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then what? And then it became that which it had imagined itself to be, and that's how creation began. And it's interesting because it's kind of the same method that Neville's encouraging us to use, to imagine us being a certain thing, right?
And he lays out right in that second paragraph the idea that imagining is the act of conditioning oneself. And as soon as I saw that, I thought of the process of hardening, which he discusses later on.
Yeah.
Just through repetition. So right there in his first presentation, in his very first book, he starts to lay it out, but he hasn't really told us all of what the code words are yet. So probably the first time somebody read this, the first time they read, they said, What? What are you talking
What
about?
is he talking about? He says, by this law, first conceiving, then becoming that conceived, all things evolve out of no thing. It's like the word nothing he's got here, but there's a hyphen, no thing. And without this sequence, there's not anything made that is made. Before Abraham or the world was, I am. When all of time shall cease to be, I am. I am the formless awareness of being, conceiving myself to be man. By my everlasting law of being, I am compelled to be and to express all that I believe myself to be. I am the eternal no-thingness contained within my formless self, the capacity to be all things. I am that in which all my conceptions of myself live and move and have their being, and apart from which they are not. I dwell within every conception of myself. From this withinness, I ever seek to transcend all conceptions of myself. By the very law of my being, I transcend my conceptions of myself only as I believe myself to be that which does transcend. I am the law of being, and beside me there is no law. I am that I am.
And at the risk of opening a can of worms, I got to ask the question, who do you think I is? Because I think most people are going to say I is God.
Yes, I think that most people would say that because of the context of these verses.
Right.
But Neville is talking about the law of being.
Mm.
And he's talking about the concept of this word or phrase, I am. And the most important thing I think we can remember here is that we can never experience anything that we're not willing to be. So many of us with law of attraction, we get very excited when we first hear about it and we understand that someone is teaching us that we can have the power to create our own experience, whatever it is we want. And immediately there's all these ideas in our head of the things that we want. And Neville is teaching us that unless we can be the person who has those things or who does those things, unless we can really step into that identity and say, I am, then we won't experience those things.
Which means in his very first chapter, in his very first book, he puts out an extraordinarily compelling and controversial idea that the I in I am isn't just God, it's all of us.
Right. Exactly.
And that's pretty revolutionary.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I'm always very, careful to say, just hang with us.
Yeah, right.
just open your mind and heart and attempt to go through these Neville ideas with no judgment.
Yes. Which is not easy to do because we have all these preconceptions that our religion has taught us and that we're having to deal with. But you're right. That's what we have to do.
But I tell you, one of the things that I learned years and years ago now, that probably is still the most important thing is the idea that our level of consciousness is directly related to our lack of judging.
Yes.
So the lower down the emotional scale we are, the lower down the energy level we are, when we're at that place where we really aren't creating much of anything in a conscious way, because our level of consciousness is at the bottom, in that place, we're making a lot of judgments.
Yes. Oh, boy.
And as we let go of judging, as we let go of making judgments, we move up the energetic scale automatically. We move up the emotional scale automatically as we let go, because those judgments are very heavy and weighty and they hold us down there at the bottom. But as we let them go, we rise up automatically. And so
can I ask you something?
It's an interesting idea. Yeah.
that word judgment. Do you use that word judgment equivalent to critical or criticizing?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because, first of all, we all have to use judgment, right?
Right.
I mean, we use good judgment when we make decisions. We have to judge how far away things are, when we're driving a car, right? There are certain judgments that we do make. But yes, when I use it, I'm actually, criticism will fall into it, into that word, the way I'm using it, but also just deciding if something is good or bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's why I always try to stay away anyway, from saying positive and negative, like positive emotions, negative emotions, good emotions, bad emotions. I make the attempt to always just say maybe they're comfortable emotions or pleasurable emotions, pleasurable feelings or uncomfortable emotions,
right.
Painful emotions and feelings. So things can be painful or pleasurable, and we still don't have to judge them as good or bad.
Yes, because I think what happens is the reason that this whole judgment / criticizing / good or bad dynamic is counterproductive is because we get into a habit of constantly finding fault with ourselves,
right.
With others, with situations. It's always find fault, find fault, find fault. And as LOA deliberate creators, we know the more that we focus on something, the more we're going to get the opportunity to experience it some more. I've discovered that in my own life in ways that are quite frustrating and quite painful. How I have, like we all do, these tendencies to, like for the longest time, I would attract problems because I was a problem solver. I was good at solving problems. And the more that I solved problems, usually for others, sometimes for myself, the more problems would come my way until finally it got to the point I had so many problems coming my way, I couldn't even handle it emotionally anymore. And I was saying, stop the problems. And then I'm continuing to help solve people's problems. And it took me a while to make the correlation like, oh yeah, if I stop trying to solve all these problems will stop coming to me. But that's the kind of thing that happens when we get into this really critical mode. We're constantly finding fault, so we're going to have more and more opportunities to find fault. It's like, really? Do you really want to do that?
Right. So the antidote to, because being a great problem solver is a wonderful tool and skill and gift.
Yeah.
So the antidote is to focus on solutions.
Solutions. Yes.
Right? And you're right about that. It's like, of course, wherever we put our focus, and if we're the person that's always focused on finding the fault, then we're going to find more and more fault. So, yeah, so I think that when I say judgment, that's what I mean. And the way you can let go of being so judgmental is to be curious instead. Like, there's an interesting idea. You know the sound that Yoda makes? Like,
yes.
Well, when you make that sound, because it's a sound we make out of curiosity, when you do that, when you make that sound, when you get curious, it's impossible to be judgmental at the same time.
That's true.
And it's impossible to worry at the same time. So remember to tap into curiosity. That idea is, look at that. Instead of judging things as, oh, this is bad. Because, good luck, bad luck.
Yeah, right. I was looking at the conversation in the comments section of people who were listening to the live stream of this, and Siraj and Sarah had a little bit of an exchange, and Siraj said that he was doing some rubbish writing, but he asked a question. He says, is there any difference between spirit and soul? To which Sarah replied, no, but some call it different things, so I thought I'd call it both. But it's an interesting question, because we do use two different terms for that. And
my definition of soul has always been the will, the mind, the emotions.
Oh, okay.
Is soul.
And what's spirit?
Spirit is a little. I equate spirit more with consciousness.
Okay. Interesting distinction. I'm not sure
the
what to do with it.
consciousness that inhabits inhabits each one of us. The part of us that is not our physical body,
Okay.
I would equate more to spirit, and soul being the part of us that has emotions. One of my favorite quotes ever, and I'm trying to remember the person who said it. I can remember her books, but not her name at this moment. But it's that Sue Monk kid. She says, if I were asked what does the soul do, I would say that the soul does two things. It loves and it creates. And I've always thought that quote was so beautiful, because that part of us, when we talk about feeding our soul, it's often a creative act. For me, I mean, I've been shopping for the last 3 days for ink, because I'm a pen and ink artist, and I love to draw, and it gets me excited to see those colors and those supplies, and it's really food for my soul. The
Sure.
same way music is, art, music, beauty. Those are the things that feed our soul.
Yeah.
I don't think they're the same as spirit, but there's a connection, because I am one. I have a body and a soul and a spirit and a mind, and they all work together, right? So,
Okay. Yeah, that's good. All right, I can go with that.
So what would Neville say?
Let's find out.
Because I'm looking at this sentence that Neville says, I am the eternal no-thingness, or I am the eternal nothingness. I am the eternal no-thingness containing within my formless self the capacity to be all things. That's really interesting.
The no-thingness kind of stops me in my tracks.
Within my formless self.
Yeah.
Because we think of ourselves as having a form. But when you start talking about spirit and soul, those things are pretty formless, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
At least I can't see the form of them. Right?
It ties in. It's a way of kind of describing where we're coming from, what position we're in, so to speak, before we start manifesting something physical.
Well, we think about also, that's why this question has been so great about soul and spirit. And we think of those things as, I do anyway, as being eternal. My body's not eternal. My body will not last forever. But my soul and my spirit will. And so if that eternal no-thingness that's inside my formless self, that has the capacity to be all things. So that's where we create from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep, that's it.
Yep.
So,
really interesting.
Very interesting.
Any questions about this first chapter? Because it's pretty weighty, and yet it does lay that foundation for where we're going with it.
Well, tons, but probably more than we could possibly figure out on our own. I say let's go on to chapter 2 and see if you can kind of frame this a little bit more for us.
Yeah, that's funny that you say that, because I realize how many times we've tried to figure out a chapter, and then we've finally gone to the next chapter, and he explains the whole
Exactly.
thing.
Exactly.
All right. So he says, this second chapter, you shall decree. And now, I'm not sure if your copy has this, because I have some things in brackets, so just read what's in brackets.
Okay.
It's a verse from the book of Job. It says, thou shalt also decree a thing, and it shall be established unto thee, and the light shall shine upon thy ways. You will also decree a thing, and it will be established for you, and light will shine on your ways. Thou shalt decree a thing, and it shall come to thee, and light shall shine in thy ways. So that's in brackets.
And that's not in this compendium, which is interesting. We've had that a number of times, and I've wondered why it was that the person who put this compendium together left these bracketed items out, or why were they included in brackets in the source that you're looking at, which I think is on the website. The discrepancy is interesting, especially considering the quality of the quote that you just read, because that's actually a quote that pretty straightforwardly describes the LOA creation process as we understand it.
Right, and then there's, I think, the Isaiah verse that's next probably is in your book.
It is.
And so maybe the editor felt it was redundant. I don't know. But it says, so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereunto I sent it. And then Neville speaks. He says, man can decree a thing, and it will come to pass. And it's interesting, right? Like, we did this last Wednesday.
Yes.
We did this when
Deidre.
we heard that Dee Dee was going to have an emergency surgery. We said, okay, let's just imagine. Let's decree a thing. Let's call it differently than what we're expecting. Let's just say no. When we come back together on Friday or whenever, we're going to have a message in the chat saying that he didn't have the surgery. Mm-hmm. And that's what came to pass. That's a wonderful thing.
It is.
All right. So man has always decreed that which has appeared in his world. He is today decreeing that which is appearing in his world, and he shall continue to do so as long as man is conscious of being man. Nothing has ever appeared in man's world but what man decreed that it should. This you may deny, but try as you will, you cannot disprove it, for this decreeing is based upon a changeless principle. Man does not command things to appear by his words, which are, more often than not, a confession of his doubts and fears. Decreeing is ever done in consciousness.
Now that's an interesting use of the word consciousness right there. Because
here's what I think is interesting, Walt, is that the beginning, the verses, the ones in brackets and in the Isaiah one, what is it talking about? Where it says, you shall decree a thing.
Yep.
It says, my word will go forth out of my mouth.
Yeah, that's true.
It's talking about speaking it, right?
Exactly.
It's talking about words.
Yeah.
And then Neville suddenly says, yeah, we're not talking about words, though. We're talking about consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the words can either be powerless or they can be empowered by the consciousness.
Well, the word consciousness...
Because people say words all the time that don't come to pass. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no doubt about it. But the use of the word consciousness here really struck me, because the previous sentence, he says, man does not command things to appear by his words, which are, more often than not, a confession of his doubts and fears. Decreeing is ever done in consciousness. And I contrasted those two, and I said to myself, doubts and fears are not consciousness.
Oh, wow.
And it makes some sense to me, because doubts and fears are low vibration. They're negative feeling stuff. And if that's true that they are not consciousness, then consciousness is only when we are feeling good.
Well, the interesting thing I see about that is that using consciousness, using the idea of being conscious as an adjective. Am I conscious of being? Mm-hmm. Or am I, because when I become conscious that my words are confessing doubt and fear, often that's when I shift my energy around it.
That's true.
Because I'm conscious, because I don't want to be just confessing doubts and fears.
So not only is consciousness not a place for doubting and fearing, it's a place for shifting things around and shifting away from doubts and fears. It's the place, and it fits perfectly, as far as I can tell, with non-Neville LOA theory, particularly Abraham theory, which states that we do our best creating when we are in our happy place. That's why we have your daily dose of happy, because we want to help encourage everybody to get to that happy place so they can do their best creating. Well, he's saying not only are you doing your best creating, that's when you're truly conscious. You're not truly conscious when you're in that negative space. And that's a different concept of consciousness than any I've ever thought of before.
Yeah, it's definitely not the same as what I would have thought in the past. Let's keep going.
Yeah.
Every man automatically expresses that which he is conscious of being. Without effort or the use of words, at every moment of time, man is commanding himself to be and to possess that which he is conscious of being and possessing. this changeless principle of expression is dramatized in all the Bibles of the world. The writers of our sacred books were illumined mystics, past masters in the art of psychology. In telling the story of the soul, they personified this impersonal principle in the form of a historical document, both to preserve it and to hide it from the eyes of the uninitiated. Today, those to whom this great treasure has been entrusted, namely the priesthoods of the world, have forgotten that the Bibles are psychological dramas representing the consciousness of man. In their blind forgetfulness, they now teach their followers to worship its characters as men and women who actually lived in time and space.
Okay, now we have a major revolution going on here.
Yes. As a matter of fact, somebody, a friend of mine, asked this question recently to a group about Neville. Said, "Well, okay, I believe that Abraham believes that Jesus was an actual person that lived in history, and I believe that Neville does not believe." And they just asked, "What say you? You know,
right.
What do you think about this?" And so there were a bunch of different commentaries going on. So yes, we should break in at this point, and you can see that Neville believes that the Bible figures that we speak of were not historical, but that they were allegory, they were just metaphor, and that it's just a great psychological drama.
Let's hang on to that thought for a second.
I don't think it's going to matter. And that's one of the things that I always bring up, because I know that this possibly makes some people feel uncomfortable or nervous. And is, we could throw out everything Neville says about any Bible in the world, and his message would still hold up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not worth getting, too ruffled over.
Right. No, I agree with you. And before we leave this thought, I want to actually go back to the previous thought about consciousness, because Shelley raised an interesting question. Shelley Epperly, who does the Monday evening podcast with me, asked the question, doubts and fears are ego. What do you think about that statement? And I know she raised that one in the context of what we were talking about, with consciousness being what we experience when we're in our highest place, not in our lowest place. So in a sense, she is counterbalancing consciousness with ego. Ego being a lower vibration state, consciousness being a higher vibrational state. What do you think? Well,
I'm going to probably stand on the side of being a little antagonistic about that idea. And I've said it before that I don't think that ego is entirely bad. And I will say the same thing about doubts and fears, that fear is actually a gift. Ask anybody who's escaped being raped or being robbed or had any other thing happen to them that is undesirable, because they felt afraid and they got out of there.
Mm-hmm. That's
true. I mean, if we will listen to our doubts and fears, and listen to them non-judgmentally, like we were talking a little while ago, not always judging everything. See, I don't even judge doubt and fear as being bad. Mm-hmm. I just think it's a feeling, it's an emotion. I think it has value if we'll just listen to it in a curious way and ask ourselves why we're feeling that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I don't want doubt and fear to be calling all the shots. Definitely not.
Right.
And I do think that most of the time our doubts and fears are unfounded. Most of the time, yes, they are uncomfortable because they're at that vibrational level that's not aligned with a higher level of consciousness. So yeah, I do agree with all of that. Mm-hmm. What I disagree with is always throwing everything out like that. Right?
Yeah, and I don't think she really actually is.
Get rid of it. That's doubt and fear. Get rid of it. We don't need that. It's a little more complex than that, I think, sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Shelley would probably agree with you on that. The thing that I'm also thinking about is, I can't remember who I was discussing this with. It may have been with Louis de Souza on Monday morning, talking about how when we're going to be dealing with contrast in our lives. That's just part of being alive. But what we really want to do is, as we kind of dip into the negative realm or dip into the lower vibrational realm, like you said, we don't actually have to stay there. We don't actually have to live there. So what we want to do is look at that and appreciate it and so forth from the higher level, from the higher vibrational state, what Neville is calling the consciousness state. Because when you're in that consciousness state, now you can handle that contrast. You don't have to go live in it, but you can learn from it. You can expand from it. So it's like dip your toe and then come back up. Touch it and then come back up. Just okay, there it is. I just experienced it. Okay, now I'm back to my higher consciousness again. Like, okay, I could live with that. That'd be good. That's actually a great goal to go for, I think.
Yeah, that's where we bring in that curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we notice that we have doubts, we have fears. Maybe our ego feels like it's taking over, and we go,
Well, it's also where the abundance comes from. You can't have abundance unless you're in a high vibrational state. But you also can't have abundance unless you go through the contrast. So that means you need to live in the high vibrational state regularly and dip your toe, dip your toe, dip your toe, and that creates the abundance.
Yeah, contrast isn't going to be a problem. There's plenty of it, right?
Yeah, right. There's not a lack of it.
We don't have to look for it. Like, it's going to show up.
Yep.
Okay, so look at this sentence here. This impersonal principle of life, which made all things, is personified as God.
Mm.
So Neville is saying that when we read the Bible, when we see it as a psychological drama, when we understand that the thing personified as God is actually an impersonal principle, and it's the energy that makes all things.
Well,
that's where we start getting into.
Impersonal is an interesting word there, because he's saying the impersonal principle of life, which makes all things, is personified as God. An impersonal principle is personified as God. An impersonal principle is God.
That's what he's saying.
Yeah. So.
But then the principle that he's speaking of, which I know we'll get to, but is that he says this is our imagination.
Yeah. Well, that is an interesting use, an interesting choice of word, impersonal, because impersonal means not person related, not having to do with a personhood.
Right.
So God has nothing to do with a personhood. And that to me is really interesting.
It is really interesting.
Yeah.
This is why we need the Neville decoder ring.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's see if I know we're getting close to the end of the podcast, so let's see if we can get through the next couple of paragraphs.
Give it a shot.
I'm not going to finish the chapter, but we'll kind of wind it up. He says, this Lord God, creator of heaven and earth, is discovered to be man's awareness of being. So that's the first time I recall him using that phrase. He usually says man's imagination. He's likening it to man's awareness of being. If man were less bound by orthodoxy and more intuitively observant, he could not fail to notice in the reading of the Bibles that the awareness of being is revealed hundreds of times throughout this literature. To name a few, I am hath sent me to you. Be still and know that I am God. I am the Lord, and there is no other God, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I am the Lord your God, and there is no other. I am the shepherd. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and know my sheep, and am known of mine. I am the door. He goes on and on with all of these verses that are I am. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way. I am the beginning and the end.
Interesting thing here.
Alpha and Omega.
Interesting thing here. You just read a whole bunch of those I ams. About half of them are missing from the book.
Yeah, some of them are in brackets.
Yeah. And when I look at what's remaining, I see now what the editor of this compendium is doing. The editor of this compendium is trying to play down this idea of the impersonal God, of the God that is not a personhood, and to play up the idea of God as is more traditionally understood. I'm seeing that pattern in the choices that were made, which is really interesting.
The thing that's in brackets in my version are the reference.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, at the beginning of that paragraph, it says, to name a few, I am hath sent me unto you. And in brackets, it says Exodus 3:14.
Mm-hmm.
And then other places, there are whole verses in brackets because they are referencing the verse before.
Mm-hmm.
But he goes on after reading all of these, I am, I am, I am. He says, I am. Man's unconditioned awareness of being is revealed as Lord and Creator of every conditioned state of being. So he is telling us that phrase together, I am, that it is our awareness of being. And he calls it an unconditioned awareness of being.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is revealed as the creator of every conditioned state of being.
Right. Which ties back to what he talked about in the first chapter.
Exactly.
Yes.
So it's like we come into the world with this state.
Right.
And it's unconditioned.
Mm-hmm.
Until what? Until we begin to use it?
Yeah. Pretty much. That's what it is.
So let's wind up with this next little bit. If man would give up his belief in a God apart from himself, recognize his awareness of being to be God, this awareness fashions itself in the likeness and image of its conception of itself. And that's parenthetical. He would transform his world from a barren waste to a fertile field of his own liking. The day man does this, he will know that he and his Father are one, but his Father is greater than he. He will know that his consciousness of being is one with that which he is conscious of being, but that his unconditioned consciousness of being is greater than his conditioned state or his conception of himself. And what I hear when I read that is that Neville is saying that our ability to create, our consciousness of being, that's the greater part of us.
Yes.
It's greater than anything that we create with it. It's greater than anything we imagine ourselves or become because of it. Because it's the part of us that's doing the creating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Exactly true. We've got about 2 minutes left, or actually about a minute left. Let's see if we can get one more paragraph in.
All right. When man discovers his consciousness to be the impersonal power of expression, which power eternally personifies itself in his conceptions of himself, he will assume and appropriate that state of consciousness which he desires to express. In so doing, he will become that state in expression. Ye shall decree a thing, and it shall come to pass. Can now be told in this manner. You shall become conscious of being or possessing a thing, and you shall express or possess that which you are conscious of being.
There it is. Laid
The
in very
law
quickly.
of consciousness is the only law of expression.
Very interesting stuff. Well, this is going to be a fun thing to finish up the chapter on and do the next chapter tomorrow morning when we resume our conversation about Neville. Before we go, though, I want to make sure that I give you a chance to tell people how to reach out to Cindy Chavez in case they're looking for like a little personal assistance or just want to share some comments or concerns or whatever. How do they reach you?
Yes, they can reach me at my website, cindychavez.com, CINDIECHAVEZ.com. I would love to have you give me a shout, give me a wave, say hello. If you're looking for coaching, I do have a couple of spots available right now. At the beginning of the year, they kind of fill up, but I have a couple.
All right.
And I would love for you to just say hello.
That sounds
Wonderful.
great. All right. Well, it's been great. I look forward to talking to you tomorrow and continue our journey on Your Faith is Your Fortune. And also, I want to thank our people who are listening to the live stream. Thank you for your comments. And to all of our listeners, we hope that you'll join us next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.
I'll be back. Bye, everyone.